the most excited we've been about a case review in a long time. This is the HAVN HS 420, and it disassembles in a really interesting way, first of all. But the main reason we liked working on this is because they're trying to do something different and innovative with the cooling design, which is basically make one of these to mount the fans and point them at the glass side panel, and then also give a flow guide that's supposed to point the air towards the glass side panel of the case, so away from everything. And the intent is that the tray goes in the bottom, like that, shoots the air this direction, might have the flow guide in there optionally, and sort of bounces it back into the front of the video card. So it's really interesting, and actually it's gonna be easier to just show a 3D animation that we made. So here's what we made. HAVN, the name of the brand for this case, is separating the hot exhaust air out of the bottom of the GPU from the cooler intake from the bottom of the case, pushing intake at the glass side panel of the case in exchange for some trade-offs, but it's a novel approach for cooling. The case comes in horizontal and vertical GPU configurations, although both are lacking parts for the other. The horizontal model effectively removes all of the vertical GPU hardware and converts it into a more traditional flat bottom case. Continuing the interesting cooling combinations, the case has these two rear slots for fans, and these can be configured a few different ways. So right now we're using reverse blade fans, that's intake, and this is exhaust. And actually this is one of the configurations that they sort of intend for, because there's no dust filter here, there is a dust filter here. And actually this case we've done, I think, 7 or so different configurations for the review today, just because the cooling can be so complicated the way it lays out. We also like that the case has a ton of quality of life features too that are really well thought out, like these pre-labeled and color-coded cable management passages that suggest optimal cable routing for new builders, or these well-placed driver pass-throughs to access screws, rubber bumpers everywhere to snugly fit modular panels into place, a manual that's actually really helpful, magnets to guide panels and screws to lock them, and on the airflow side, even the structural support for the panels was positioned so that it only overlaps the dead zones of the fans rather than obstructing the actual intake areas. As an alternative to the side intake we just showed, there's this spine-like drive cage arrangement. And the case is made up of these large, relatively heavy-duty panels that, in the case of this panel, uses these tiny plastic wheels to glide into place. It's got a rails system on top to combine the front and the side panel, large sheet of glass, and then just sort of socketed in like you saw when I removed it earlier. It's a very interesting case. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's C1500 Platinum Power Supply, which has passed the Cybernetics Titanium standard for efficiency. NZXT has been certified for efficient operation upwards of 94% and uses a 140mm fan to help run quieter under load. This 180mm form factor power supply is fully modular, using capacitors rated for 105 degrees Celsius. Learn more at the link in the description below. One of the things we noticed with this case is that it has some elements that look really similar to height cases, actually. And so we asked Height, and it appears that Height has opened some doors for HAVN, because HAVN is using the same factory as Height is. So these are the Y60s and 70s. They're not related at all, the companies. They just happen to use the same supplier. And there's some design sort of motif here, but it's the manufacturing techniques that carry over a little bit, like some of the ways that they work with the steel and fold it for some of the finer details on the shapes in the case. So HAVN's a new brand, but it's not necessarily a new company. It is part of Pro Gamerswear, which is part of CaseKing, or one of the largest retailers in Europe. So that's what we're looking at today. This is the HS 420. It has two models. They are $200 for the horizontal GPU one, which is this one here. You can tell because of the horizontal part. That means this way. And then there's the vertical GPU one, which we have here. This is $270. One of the things we're doing with this case is a separate fan placement optimization guide. That's going to be a separate video. We used to do these a lot. It's been a little while because things weren't changing a whole lot, but this case has changed enough. We're going to have a follow-up with all that, but we still have 6 or 7 configurations tested, such as this one, where currently this fan is intake, but we've also done them with an exhaust. We've done tests with the top fan as exhaust versus intake, and that's one of the things we're going to be looking at. So HAVN says its team members include people who come from Fractal, NZXT, Cooler Master, Sapphire, and some other companies, so they should have some experience. And in addition to having case designers who came from its now competitors, HAVN also has a hit list of cases it's targeting. HAVN has called out a list of competition for the HS420, including the Phanteks NV7, Lian O11D XL, not the Evo, Corsair 5000D, NZXT H9 2023, assuming they introduce a new one, and the Fractal Torrent. For the HS420 vGPU, it's the height Y60 competition, although we think the Y70 might be more fair. And for our own list, we'd bring attention to price competition from, again, the height Y70 non-touch, the Fractal North XL, the Antec Flux Pro with 6 fans, and the Montec K95 Pro, which is cheaper on this list. We're highlighting these primarily for proximity and price to the $200 case, while still being good cases overall. So the HS420 is an unusual looking case. It has this 90-degree bend with the panoramic glass. That's one of their highlight features, which they do with a relatively tight radius on that front panel down in the corner. Then one of the other interesting visual elements of it is that jutting out cable management shroud cubby area under the video card. The case also has a consistency where it's got these rounded edges everywhere. You might remember our Kin 65 Squircle discussion, but let's just leave that there. And underneath, this trend continues, but it's also got a completely flat bottom tray under that, which we were just talking about, and that would help with putting it on carpet or something, because then you're not eating some of that intake area. That's critical for a case with bottom intake. And then finally, another interesting thing is these. The cable management grommets have these almost like rubber strain-like pieces in the pass-through itself, which is just something different. So that side panel, that rolls into the case with 4 plastic wheels, and then it slots into place with support along the whole bottom edge. It takes some getting used to, but HAVN includes stickers detailing removal on the case. The manufacturing precision required to get this working and working well is beyond what we typically see on cases for mechanical design, and it's executed expertly. All the exterior panels are firmly magnetically attached and include optional screw holes for extra security while shipping or just moving it. You hear in most of our reviews that we favor at least optional screws for panel security to prevent issues. The visual theming for the case is consistent throughout, so they even have browns. Vocabulary we haven't had to bust out since the Odyssey X review, and that is precisely why you come to us for reviews. It's for vocabulary like brown, or squircle. Polyhedron is another example, or tetrahedron as found in 20-sided and 4-sided dice, like in tabletop RPGs such as D&D 3.5 edition. And you can subscribe to our channel for more about obscure geometric shapes. The HS420 was impressively packed with a level of care that we usually only see with pre-built. It has instructions on the box about how to correctly unload the case, a big "Start Here" label for the manual and accessories, and even a custom-shaped piece of foam under the fabric loop on the top panel to hold its shape. The manual itself is well done and reminds us of how Fractal does its own manuals, which we've praised several times on this channel. The accessory kit includes a VESA mount, ESD-safe gloves, and extra combs for the rubber cable organizers inside the case. Now, one thing that we see commonly on $200+ cases or $80 cases is screw organizers, but what HAVN does instead is they ship labeled reusable bags with unlabeled disposable bags of screws inside of them. So, good job, guys. You almost did it. The cheaper non-VGPU model of the case comes with this bottom fan tray. This is not included in the VGPU option. And it also comes with a GPU support, also not included in the VGPU option, that extends horizontally there. So that support bracket is solid cast zinc alloy braced against a completely rigid section of the power supply shroud to support the GPU at its furthest corner. It works better than most GPU supports, and we like it. Our only complaint is that the support can only work as shown in the manual for GPUs up to 300mm long. Any longer, and the bracket can't reach all the way to the end as intended. It still works though. As for the vGPU model, it comes with a pre-installed 4-slot vertical GPU bracket and what HAVN claims is a PCIe 5.0 riser cable. Currently, there are no PCIe 5.0 consumer GPUs. However, the 50 series is possible to go in this direction. There's not a great non-enterprise way to validate the 5.0 claim from HAVN, and performance impact is yet unknown, but likely minimal for consumer. The vGPU model's bottom fan bracket is replaced with an angled bracket for those 3140 fans and that curved glass pane that we showed to direct the air. The GPU bracket can be adjusted back and forth, which is necessary in order to get the corner of the GPU flush with the curved airflow shield as shown in the manual. Our 4070 Ti Super isn't fat enough to get this this as close to the shield as HAVN suggests, using it precisely as they intend requires a GPU with a cooler that's 4 slots thick. There are 11 total fan mounts regardless of SKU, all of which can accept either 140 or 120 except the VGPU's bottom fan mounts, which are 140 only. The case doesn't include any fans, but 2 PWM splitters with 6 outputs each are included, so up to 12 PWM fans can be controlled from 2 inputs. Now, to help explore the enclosure's unique airflow options, we made a 3D animation, so let's check that out. There are a ton of potential airflow paths with the way this case is built. This custom 3D animation that we made will help explain some of the more unique ones, and you can support these educational animations on store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus. First, let's look at how the VGPU kit will direct the air. This will cover the theory, but we'll talk actual performance and impact to thermals and acoustics in our charts soon. Mounting the fans to the VGPU fan bracket at the bottom of the case angles them toward the glass side panel, resulting in an indirect flow path to the GPU fans. The bracket itself is at about a 30-degree angle. The shortest and most direct path to the GPU would be flat fans in the bottom, pointed straight at the video card. But that path would sort of collide with the hot exhaust coming out of the bottom of the card. This designed and angled path tries to almost bounce the air off the glass or flow it out and nearby, at which point the video card fans will pull that air in. There are 2 interesting challenges here. First is the absence of a wall. Vertically mounted video cards, which is the intended use with this kit, with vertically oriented fins, will eject the hot air down out the bottom of the card and up out the top of the card because of how the fins are oriented. In this orientation, that means hot air shoots straight down into the intake fans, theoretically getting mixed in with cool intake as it's shot at the glass. But since there's no wall, the air will also enter the GPU more directly and at a wider spread at the front of it, including some potential exhaust and likely at higher speed. Thanks to Bernoulli's principle, the general idea is that air increasing in velocity will decrease in pressure and vice versa, although there are exceptions. The upside is that the air will be directly fed to the GPU. Adding a glass shroud to the fan tray acts as a flow guide, but it'll also require the air to now make multiple turns to get to the GPU. The glass attaches to the back of the angled fan tray. This flow guide will push cool air at the glass side panel of the case, at which point it'll either physically deflect from hitting the glass or will be overpowered sort of mid-flight and pulled in by the GPU's own fans. Likewise, hot air exiting the GPU bottom out of vertically oriented fins will now get shoved behind the glass and behind the fan tray. The back of the fan tray is fully enclosed by steel and glass, so there won't be any hot air ingress. The glass shroud walls the hot air off. Instead, it ends up in a small chamber between the cable management shroud and the fan tray. This air will need to find a way out, and the most likely pathway is the bottom rear fan. We'll come back to that. Focusing on intake first, this whole setup results in the intake air now making multiple turns, which will affect both the air velocity and the air pressure. Velocity at the point where it enters the video card will be decreased because it's taking turns and it has an indirect path. Because the fans themselves are angled, the air ends up making close to a 90-degree turn, shallower than if they were flat in the bottom with the flow guide and no fan tray, but still a big change in direction. The glass shroud itself has 2 points where it bends and a straight section. The first is a 40-degree angle and then about a 50-degree angle. These bends will help reduce resistance compared to harder angles. Back to the hot air from the card that was stuck behind the tray, glass, and between the cable management indent. In theory, as exhaust, a rear bottom fan should help pull hot air trapped under the video card and behind the tray out of the case. It'll also steal some of the cool intake from the backmost bottom-mounted fan in the tray, but the angle of the tray should reduce this impact. If the back fan is flipped to intake, it might help push that hot air that was stuck behind the tray and between the cable management area towards the front of the case. It'll force it through, where it'll likely slowly be pulled up and out by CPU cooler fans or top-mounted fans, or impacted by any potential side fans. Flow-through video cards, like most modern video cards, including ours, will exhaust their hot air through the right side of the card and effectively straight at the chipset and RAM area of the motherboard. A CPU tower cooler will pull this air out. In absence of that, a top-mounted liquid cooler with exhaust fans could remove it. As for video cards with horizontally oriented fins, there's really no downside with this whole bottom intake setup that we're talking about, with or without the shroud, because they typically can't breathe or exhaust through the bottom of the card it would mostly exit out the left and right sides, often out the rear PCIe slots. These fin orientations are less common these days, though, on the huge video cards. HAVN clearly thought about the configuration of the fan tray and the glass. There are a lot of intentional angles. The flow direction is clearly intentional. This configuration was thought about. It doesn't mean it's good, but they definitely thought a lot about it. We'll have to test how much the glass and the angled intake actually do by running thermals against it, including against just standard flat bottom intake fans, to see how good it actually is. Let's visualize some other setups in 3D first, though, just quickly. This configuration uses a vertical GPU, removes the bottom fans and the shield, and instead installs 3 side intake fans, 2 rear exhaust fans, and 1 front top intake positioned about 30 millimeters away from the front of the tower cooler's front fan. In this orientation, flow follows this path. It mostly enters the side, at which point the air is pulled towards the tower cooler or the vertical GPU by the fans on each. The GPU hot exhaust will mostly get pulled out of the way of intake through the bottom rear exhaust fan, which also helps provide the currents needed to pull intake toward the GPU from both the bottom of the case, passively through the floor, and the lower intake side fan. The rear exhaust fan at the top helps remove exhaust from both the CPU tower cooler and the vertical GPU fin stack. Finally, the front top intake is interesting. We always see people asking why you'd fight physics, but the rate of passive molecular movement or air movement from things like heat, especially just heat rising, is incredibly slow. The truth of the matter is that a 1,000 plus RPM fan, or 6 of them, will overpower just about any natural air movement in a way that makes the natural movements largely irrelevant, at least for this configuration. It does start to matter as you go more passive. So what matters here is more the access to the external air by those fans, not whether it's at the top or the bottom of the case. Top intake would provide direct external air straight into the CPU cooler. Now, putting a top exhaust fan here will actually serve to steal the cool intake and exhaust it before it ever hits the CPU tower cooler, so it can make things worse depending on where you put the fan, reducing some of that air available to the CPU tower. You could instead move that fan, though, to the rear exhaust position after the CPU tower cooler, and that's a test we actually did run we'll talk about. There are a ton of other really cool configuration options with this case. We're only showing what you can do with 6 fans in this animation for a lot of reasons. One of them is just sort of we had to pick a number, and that allowed us to budget 6 fans around it. We have 5 other configurations we ran. We'll go through all of those in our testing section. And there are a ton more combinations that are complicated, but this should at least get in the mindset for thinking about how we're going to work with this case and why it's so interesting to try and optimize it. So the HS420 is a big enthusiast case in an era where big enthusiast components are dwindling, except for GPUs. And it's imposingly large. It's heavy too. Empty, it's 18 to 19 kilograms. So if you want a big case, you have to find something to put in it. And these days, multi-GPU is basically dead. The 2.5 inch and 3.5 inch drive count has gone down overall. The case says it supports motherboards up to 277 millimeters in length, so basically eATX, but we wouldn't recommend eATX boards in this case because they'll overlap with the cable management cutouts and just look kind of messy. And so that brings us to, finally, the VESA support. The VESA mount can optionally replace the side fan bracket with a 14-inch screen inside the case, which could pull some consumers away from the HeightY 70 Touch at the cost of some drive support. Even if you don't need the drive trays, though, they look cool enough to keep installed. They're not really in the way as long as you don't do side intake. Each of the 4 boxes can fit either one 3.5-inch drive or 2 2.5-inch drives, with 1 mount recessed for cable clearance. Cable management is laid out logically and has plenty of Velcro straps, although cables need to be managed tightly to keep the flexible center of the side panel from bulging out. The ATX 24-pin, EPS 12-volt, and potentially GPU and SATA cables all share a single channel, which requires more effort to manage. The screws and the magnets are more than enough to keep the panel from popping off, though. The rubber strips in place of normal rubber grommets are also just different. So the rear of the case, motherboard and GPU I/O is hidden and difficult to see, which is an unfortunate combination with the minimalistic front panel I/O, which is just 2 Type A USB ports, 1 Type C, and a combined audio jack. Now, on a positive side, the USB Type C port is connected to this flat ribbon-style cable, which makes it much easier to manage and route. So there's a lot going on with this case, and now we need to get into thermal testing, which is going to be very complicated this time. Because it endeavors to compete with the best cases on our charts, we needed to see if it could actually beat the best. We decided then to standardize against a set of fans taken from one of the best cases on the charts, which is the Antec Flux Pro. That case comes with 6 fans, and it has held the first rank in some of the tests recently. We pulled all 6 of its fans, the same ones, so that's 4 140s, which is perfect for the bottom intake configuration and sides, plus an extra, and then 2 120 reverse blade fans. This allows us to make direct head-to-head comparisons by fan count, or standardizing for fans, except this time a different set. We've noted for a long time the limitations of our standardized fan testing methods and cases, so for this review we decided to experiment with something different. We might start instead standardizing against a case that directly competes in a similar class with the one under review, which would give fewer individual case reference points, but it would allow us to test against head-to-head competition in a controlled way with the same fans in a more optimized setup. That's the goal here. Here's the table. So this marks a sort of new trial in our case reviews and enabled us to do more configurations for this case. Let us know if you like it and this approach, and we'll apply it to future cases as well. You can post in the comments. So here are the 8 configurations we ran, which, by the way, took a huge amount of extra time for this case. And we only had a few days working with it with Arrow Lake coming up, so we might do more later here. The tests labeled A are with some form of bottom intake. A1 has the angled tray and glass. A2 ditches the glass. A3 goes for a flat mount, ditching both. The rest of their setup is the same. Tests labeled B are with side intake. Remember, the budget is 6 fans to match the leading Flux Pro, so we stopped there for now. We weren't going to do both bottom and side just because of that objective. That's a separate thing. We want to do it though. For this, we experimented with variations on the single 140mm fan on the top, moving it to either in front of the cooler by about 30 millimeters as intake, or behind it as exhaust. We also experimented with the rear bottom fan, swapping it to either intake straight into the GPU or exhaust. This quick table shows the rank of each configuration in GPU thermals and CPU thermals. It's a summary chart. We'll look at the actual results in a moment, but this helps us recap it. The best combined performer here was configuration B1, which had a vertical GPU without bottom fans. It had 3 side intake fans, 1 mid-front intake fan up top, and 2 rear exhaust fans. The best performer for GPU thermals was B3, which was a horizontal GPU, side intake, no bottom fans, and intake in the rear bottom of the case. But it was at the cost of CPU thermals, ranking 7th of 8 configurations. The best CPU performer was B2, which has a horizontal GPU, side intake fans, rear exhaust, and the top fan arranged as CPU tower intake. Let's move on to individual data for inspection with just the HAVN case first. Here's the chart for the GPU thermals at full speed. The total spread is 4.6 degrees, which is actually pretty wide for GPU thermal differences in our testing. Starting with the glass flow guide, our direct comparison of A1 versus A2 has identical setup aside from the guide. On the chart, A1 with the angled fans and glass shroud performed the worst, with A2 performing 1.8 degrees better for GPU average temperature. It's a real difference, and it's outside of expected variance. A2 is identical, but removes the glass shroud, so it's actually hurting it here. The best performer for the GPU was a horizontal GPU and side intake with B3. This isn't too surprising. Horizontal GPUs often breathe better, but if you truly wanted a vertical GPU for display, our best performing vertical setup was B1, which uses side intake, a top intake fan in front of the CPU cooler, and 2 rear exhaust fans. Of course, you could always add more fans in or change it up if you weren't sticking to a strict fan budget for comparisons like we're doing here, but the optimization thing, that'll be a different video. A3 is next, this time with 3 bottom intake fans but mounted flat rather than in an angled tray. This is a direct comparison to A1 and A2 without any changes. In our testing, it appears that the special bracket for the bottom fans and all the complicated curves and turns and glass are hindering performance. Makes sense. Air shooting straight in and without reroutes is just performing better with test A3. Looking at CPU thermals in detail, configurations B2, B1, and A3 are functionally identical. A3 with the flush-mounted bottom intake fans did better for the CPU than those where the fans were angled at the glass. Config A2 was about 2 degrees worse than B2, so the total spread here is largely inconsequential. It'd make more sense to choose based on GPU performance than CPU tower performance between these configurations. Side intake, though, is favored. For VRM and memory thermals, there's another relatively wide spread, actually, of about 6 degrees on system memory. B1 runs at 13 degrees over ambient for DDR5, which is impressive. B3 runs at 19 degrees over ambient, totally fine, but 6 degrees warmer shows an inefficiency between the two. The cooler result benefits from an intake fan immediately above the RAM and VRM. Time to go to the competitive benchmarks. This chart is for GPU thermals with fans at full speed. We've removed all configs for the HAVN case except for the best and the worst. You can find the full HAVN data in the prior charts. Again, remember the HAVN case doesn't include fans. Because of this, its performance is basically whatever we want it to be, based on the fans we choose. We normalized it to the Antec Flux Pro, so that's our direct competition. And the Flux Pro wins. Antec's thermals are superior for the GPU while maintaining roughly equivalent noise levels. Functionally, noise normalizing HAVN and fan normalizing it for the Flux Pro, which is very convenient. The HAVN case still does well and ranks right alongside the Torrent, which has remained an impressive show of force for Fractal. So HAVN is doing well. It's just that it's not totally dominating the charts as much as we might have wanted to see for a case so thoughtfully focused on new approaches to fan placement. It's a good start though. A1 has the bottom intake bracket in VGPU and landed lower down the chart. We'd favor the horizontal GPU solution. The HS420 HGPU B3 is outperforming the Antec C8, but only slightly outperforming the Heightwise 70, which has half the fan count here. For CPU thermals, we've added B2 to this chart as it was the best for CPU performance. At full fan speed, the HAVN case with the best configuration we've tested so far landed functionally tied with the Flux Pro using its alternate PSU mount. Noise levels are about the same. This has the HAVN HS420 led by the Flux Pro with the standard power supply orientation. It's also led by the 216 and the 207 from Lian Li. The North XL is also about tied with the HS420, but is much louder at 45 dBA, where these HS420 configs land closer to 39 to 40 dBA. The Antec comparison is the most relevant, again, because of the identical fans. So the case does fine. It's sad to see it not do better with all the special tuning they've done. It's not like it's bad. It's still in the top ranks of the charts. And the HAVN team itself, looking back at our emails, thought that the horizontal GPU configuration of the case would do better in our testing. And they were right. The vertical GPU setup, as fancy as it is, it's still all about balancing the looks with the sort of native disadvantages of a vertical GPU setup in a case. Now, although thermals are our focus and our primary thing we care about with case reviews, we also talk a lot about build quality and design and things like that. From a thermal perspective, purely, HAVN has not become the new best on the charts. Again, it's not bad, but it didn't hit that best marker. They got pretty close for a first case, especially out of HAVN, which is, again, formed from sort of a larger entity, but it is beaten by cheaper cases on just purely the thermal front. Cases aren't all about thermals, though. There's a lot of nuance in the reviews. And the HAVN case, so all three of us on the team who were hands-on with this regularly, it's Patrick, Mike, and me, we're all working on this a lot. We did multiple teardowns, rebuilds, all the configurations. So we all kind of came to the same conclusions. This case is genuinely, in a lot of ways, a revolutionary design. It makes some major changes that we haven't really seen a lot of, and they work in most situations. Now, this whole vertical GPU setup, the way they laid it out, conceptually, you can make it make sense. Like in the animation, we were explaining how it should work. It didn't execute as well as just doing a standard vertical GPU and going for tradition for the approach. But there are a lot of other aspects of the case that were executed flawlessly, and we do think that this is something that a lot of the other players in the industry will be looking at, and they should be, to try and take bits and pieces to try and improve upon and further advance what's going on in big cases. So Patrick, Mike, and I were all in total agreement that the quality is overall phenomenal for the build itself. We can't overstate the attention to detail put into the HS420. As a rapid-fire list, some of the small details we liked were these. The top cover of the case has structural ribs that are specifically spaced to align with the hubs and the edges of top-mounted fans, minimizing overlap with the fan blades. The right side panel does the same, intentionally aligning the blockages from structural elements with dead zones on the fans. This is awesome attention to detail that we don't commonly see. So that's well thought out. There are protective rubber dampers on basically everything, on the screws and the tabs that attach the fan trays to the case, on the 120mm adapters for the rear fans, on the post that the bottom fan mount rests on the airflow shield, and under a fragile corner in the middle of the rear panel. There are color-coded stickers with recommendations for routing cables through certain channels, and these stickers are placed over molded outlines. The case has optional screws everywhere, magnets to help click the panels into place and guide them, and guides that are sturdy and well built. The rear slots were thought through, with an optional filter on the bottom and none on the top, since blocking exhaust is pointless. The vertical GPU, despite its weaker performance, is positioned to maximize viability for hotter cards. It's easier, actually, to point out the areas where attention to detail is lacking, since we really only found a couple places. So first, there's no vibration damping in the hard drive cages in here, despite all of the rubber everywhere else on the case, including on the hard drive cage side panel mount thing. And then second, the dust filter on the lower side is just, it doesn't eject cleanly, and it's kind of flimsy for the rest of the case. So it feels a little out of place. One final note too, I observed when doing the vertical GPU configuration, it is actually kind of annoying to work with if you have to maintain it. But just as an example, the fourth of the 4 screws holding the lower fan in is obstructed by the vertical GPU mount, which means you have to take a lot of stuff out to get to that screw. So some small details like that, but mostly things that wouldn't affect you in a meaningful way if you're just building it once. The conclusion it leads us to, based on the data we have, is for both Patrick and I, if we were gonna buy this case, we both feel the same way. We'd buy the horizontal GPU one. It's $70 cheaper, which is a huge discount compared to the $270 vertical GPU solution. And unless you wanna showcase the GPU, we were not able to find a thermal benefit to setting it up vertically. So that kind of leads us to the horizontal one. And $200 puts it in direct competition with a lot of other good $200 cases, whereas $270 is kind of on that high side. It's a lot harder to justify. So $200 puts it in close range of, for example, the Flux Pro, which this is technically a little bit worse than in the charts, but we think the build quality and the ease of installation features are far superior in the HAVN case, and it's more future looking with its concepts. The Flux Pro though does really well on tradition, and that's just fine too. We like both cases. If you want something less traditional, HAVN manages to at least hit the basics while advancing parts of the case design industry. And we don't want to beat a dead horse here too much, but this feels like the case that Trikes wanted to make with the Luca L70. It's a weird new design from an unknown company with some big money behind it. It's roughly the same size, the L70, and the Luca's price falls right between the two SKUs. But the HS420 is more solidly built, it's more practical, it has better cooling once fans are added, and in our opinions, it looks better too. So closing then, overall we like the case. I genuinely was a little bit disappointed that the thermals weren't the true best on the chart, only because the expectation was so high, because you could look at it and see all this intent behind everywhere they placed fan positions. But it still does well, realistically. And all of that is with standardized fans against the Antec Flux Pro, so that's really our marker there. Does it beat the Flux Pro? And it didn't, but it was pretty close in some situations. So when I was talking with Patrick, he said this for his concluding thoughts. He said, I would personally buy this case retail if I didn't need a ton of drives. I haven't felt that way about a case we've covered in several years. And then Mike and Patrick both are hopeful that HAVN branches out into cheaper and smaller cases. This is pretty large and clumsy to handle. And then our other thought was that we just hope that they don't make a liquid cooler next, because it seems like that's what these types of companies do next. Just make more cases, please. Keep advancing it. All right, so the VGPU version, not really our thing, so we're more in favor of the $200 version of the HS420. The build quality is way up there, like with height, for the price point. And obviously there's plenty of good cases that are cheaper if it's not in the budget. There's a lot of stuff out there. We have reviews on the channel. Check them out if you want to see more. But that's it for this one. Great first showing from HAVN. This is a fantastic starting point for a platform to try and do some cool things thermally. And maybe in the next cases, they'll manage to hit both the top of the chart and maintain the build quality. So we'll see what they do next. But check out the rest of the reviews on the channel. And you can also go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to support us directly, like by buying one of our PC building mod mats, or if you'd like to grab one of the North Carolina Hurricane Relief charity shirts we're doing. We are running these for a couple weeks. We're gonna make all the units, and then we're splitting the profits, 100% of them, between 3 different groups that are detailed on the store page. You can learn more about that in Hardware News. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.